Welcome to the Enriching Book Club, where we take the greatest ideas ever written and bring them to life for the modern mind. Which timeless masterpiece are we unlocking today? Let's find out.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the deepest, most complex, and honestly just absolutely fascinating masterpieces of 20th century literature, Mikhail Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita. Now, this isn't just your standard story. It's a political satire, it's a religious allegory, a totally wild romance, and a really profound meditation on freedom. The stakes here are incredibly high, not just for the characters in the narrative, but in the actual, real world where this book was written.
To really get this book, we've got to understand the incredibly intense world that birthed it. Bulgakov was writing during the brutal rule of Joseph Stalin in Soviet Russia. We are talking about a society where truth was actively denied, where state-sponsored lies literally became the absolute norm. Artists weren't just criticized, right? They were persecuted, exiled, or worse. Bureaucracy completely replaced basic human empathy, and this rigid top-down ideology was designed to erase the independent human spirit. So, in this kind of environment, writing this novel wasn't just some harmless exercise in fiction. It was a highly dangerous act of rebellion.
Okay, let's dive into this and look at our roadmap. 1. A novel against fear. 2. 3 interwoven narratives. 3. Redefining good and evil. 4. The power of love. And finally, 5. Truth versus fear.
So, Section 1. A novel against fear. A world of oppression.
10. That is the number of years Bulgakov spent agonizing over, writing, and rewriting this razor-sharp critique of Soviet reality. Think about that for a second. Over a decade of his life poured into a manuscript that he knew, with absolute certainty, could never be published during his lifetime. I mean, the censorship was just too absolute, the danger was way too real, and yet, he wrote it anyway.
And how exactly does he critique this deeply oppressive, strictly atheistic state? Well, he brilliantly drops the devil directly into the middle of it. Bulgakov introduces Satan to 1930s Moscow. But here's the catch. He doesn't introduce Satan to glorify evil. Not at all. Instead, Satan acts as a mirror, exposing the utter hypocrisy, the greed, and the sheer absurdity of a society that somehow claims to have built a perfect, rational utopia.
Moving right along to Section 2. 3 interwoven narratives, intersecting timelines. Now, the absolute genius of this novel is how it juggles 3 distinct timelines that deeply intersect. First up, we have Satan's chaotic visit to Moscow. Second, we have the contemporary story of the Master, who is this broken, persecuted writer. And third, woven right into the text as a novel within the novel, is the ancient story of Jesus and Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem. So keep this mental map in mind as we explore how these totally different worlds connect.
We start off with the Moscow narrative. Satan, who goes by the name Wuland here, arrives with what honestly has to be the most bizarre entourage in all of literature. You've got Koroviev, the trickster, Azazello, the brute, Hela, the vampire, and Behemoth. And Behemoth is, quite literally, a giant, vodka-drinking, pistol-wielding, talking black cat. I mean, you really can't make this stuff up. Together, they immediately start creating this hilarious, surreal, surface-level chaos all over the city.
But here is the absolutely crucial point. Evil does not create corruption, it simply reveals it. Wolin and his giant cat don't just run around tempting innocent people into committing sins. They don't have to. The greed, the vanity, the dishonesty, the cowardice, it's already there, baked right into the citizens of Moscow. The devil's crew merely pulls back the curtain so that everyone can finally see it. Which brings us to our second narrative, focusing on the character known only as the Master. He's a writer who has authored this brilliant novel about Pontius Pilate, but the Soviet literary establishment just utterly destroys him for it. He's humiliated, rejected, sent to a psychiatric ward, and he completely loses all faith in himself. The Master is actually widely seen as a partial self-portrait of Bulgakov himself, and it asks us directly, what happens to an artist in a world where truth is forbidden? Well, the answer is that the totalitarian system fundamentally crushes their spirit.
And you know that novel The Master wrote? Well, that is our third narrative, set in ancient Jerusalem. Here, Bulgakov presents a beautifully written account of Jesus and Pontius Pilate. But unlike traditional narratives you might know, the central figure here is Pilate. He is the most tragic character. Pilate knows Jesus is innocent. He knows that condemning him is a gross injustice, yet he sends him to his death anyway simply because he's terrified of Emperor Tiberius. He acts out of pure, unadulterated fear. This leads us to one of the most powerful critiques in the entire story. Bulgakov proposes that the gravest sin is not cruelty, but moral cowardice. Let that sink in.
Pilate isn't inherently evil, he just entirely lacks the courage to do what he knows is right. This is a razor-sharp, subtle critique of people living under totalitarian regimes, like Stalin's Russia, who clearly recognize the horrible injustice happening right around them, but consciously choose to remain perfectly silent just to protect themselves.
All right, on to Section 3. Redefining good and evil, a complicated reality.
Now, what's really interesting here is how this completely challenges the simplistic divisions we're so used to. Traditionally, we put Jesus and light on one side and Satan or Wuland and darkness on the other, right? But Bulgakov argues that reality is far more complicated than that. The great paradox of this book is that Wuland is not Satan in the conventional, purely evil sense. I mean, in Moscow, he's actually the one punishing the fraudsters, the corrupt officials, and the hypocrites. Sometimes, believe it or not, the devil appears to be the most moral character in the room.
Bulgakov really underscores this by echoing Goethe's Faust. Wuland represents this incredibly famous quote, "I am part of that power which eternally wills evil and eternally works good." Wuland isn't the antagonist trying to destroy creation. Instead, he's presented as this cosmic force that is absolutely necessary for maintaining balance in the world. Which really forces us to pause and ask, can light exist without darkness? Wuland repeatedly suggests to other characters that light derives its entire meaning from the very existence of shadows. Without shadows, the world is just a blinding, featureless void. This is a fascinating idea that pulls heavily from Gnostic traditions, Christian mysticism, and dialectical philosophy, adding just an incredible layer of philosophical depth to the story. Section 4. The Power of Love, a Redemptive Force.
Enter Margarita. She is the master's lover, and frankly, she is one of the greatest female characters in all of world literature. While the master is passive and broken by the state, Margarita is fierce, active heroism personified. When he collapses, she fights. She sacrifices everything. She dares to make a literal deal with the devil, agreeing to become the queen of Satan's horrific midnight ball, and all of it just to save the man she loves. Her love isn't just a fleeting romantic emotion. It's a powerful, active, redemptive force.
Because of Margarita's incredible bravery, Wuland grants her a wish, and she asks for the master's freedom and his destroyed manuscript. When the master admits he actually threw his book into the fire, Wuland produces it, perfectly intact, and delivers the novel's most iconic line, "Manuscripts don't burn." The profound message here is that truth can be persecuted. It can be heavily censored, and it can be hidden away, but it can never be completely destroyed. It is such a beautiful reflection of Bulgakov's own suppressed masterpiece finally reaching the world.
And finally, Section 5. Truth versus Fear, the central theme.
This central theme brilliantly illustrates the true dividing line of the novel. The characters aren't split into good and evil. They are actually split into those who are afraid and those who dare. On one side, you have Pilate and the Soviet bureaucrats, completely paralyzed by their fear of authority. On the flip side, you have Margarita, Jesus, and even Wuland, who dare to act truly and authentically. The novel argues that the exact moment you sacrifice the truth for your own personal security, you lose your soul. Let's really let this sink in for a moment. The deepest message of Bulgakov's work is this single realization. The fundamental struggle is not between good and evil. It is between truth and fear. Satan is not the true enemy of humanity in this book. Fear is. Fear is what breaks the master. Fear is what makes Pilate fail, and fear is what poisons the entirety of Moscow society. Let's move to the ending and see how this builds to a profoundly human conclusion. At the end of it all, the master and Margarita do not enter heaven. The master is granted rest, but not light. Why is that? Well, because Jesus represents perfect spiritual light, and the master, while definitely not a wicked man, is not a saint either. He broke under the massive pressure of the state, he lost his faith out of sheer fear, so he doesn't receive ultimate transcendence, but he does receive peace. It's a deeply empathetic, very grounded ending rather than a strict theological one. The Master and Margarita is so much more than just a fantasy or a clever satire. It forces us to confront the mirrors in our own lives, and it leaves us with this heavy, lasting question. How do you preserve your inner freedom when the world demands that you surrender it? Will you be like Pilate and the bureaucrats, bowing to fear? Or will you be like Margarita, daring to stand by the truth, knowing that ultimately manuscripts don't burn? Take some time to think about that and how you might answer.